Okay, I'm going to do a book review. The name of the book is David Copperfield. Right here on the cover is David when he was a young boy, and he's meeting with Emily, who was the adopted daughter of the brother of his sort of nursemaid, Mrs. Peggotty. So Emily was a nice girl. She grew up to be very pretty, and that's going to become relevant to the story. But he just had a joyous time. The house of Mr. Peggotty was like a boat. This picture shows David when he was a young boy. His mother was a very sweet lady, but his father died before he was born. He starts out the book talking about events that happened before he was born, and that's a literary mechanism that's really, he got that idea from Lawrence Stern, who wrote the book Tristram Shandy, okay, talking about events before he was born. And so anyways, then his mother remarried this guy named Murdstone, and you can tell from that name, Murdstone, like Murderstone. He was very cruel. He always insisted on discipline, be firm. He was a total a-hole, and he was very cruel to David. David hated him for good reason. And he actually brought his sister to the house too. And then they sent David off to boarding school, which was a very cruel thing to do, the way it was done. They sent him during summer when there was no one there, so he was all by himself with no one to talk to. It was done intentionally to punish him. And what was really happening was the new stepfather with his sister were basically stealing the house from his mother. And she was kind of a weak, fragile woman, and they got away with it. I'm just showing you these paintings first before I go into a little more literary analysis of the book. Because then it'll make more sense. Okay, here's young David when he's with the sort of nursemaid lady, the lady who was a servant to his mother, Mrs. Peggotty. Okay, and he's reading, and she's encouraging him to read. She's very nice to him, and he needed that. She kind of became a surrogate mother to him for a while. Okay. And here's just some more pictures from the book here. This is, I think that's supposed to be Murdstone. I'm not sure about that. There's Miss Peggotty. Here's David when he's a little boy, and here he is when he was sort of a young man. Okay. And he would get sent places all by himself, and the stagecoach driver, Mr. Barkis, was pretty nice to him. But there was kind of a lot of scary times, for the young kid. He's going around doing things. He's very young, and he's got nobody to supervise him. He's an orphan at a very young age. And David Copperfield said this was his favorite book because it's like an autobiography. A lot of it was events from his own life. Here he is at the boarding school. And he went to 2 different boarding schools. At one of them, they were very cruel to him, and all the boys were spanked and hit a lot. At this other one, they were pretty nice to him. Okay, so he has good memories of joking around with the other guys when he was a young guy. This was one of his classmates at the boarding school, a very good-looking guy by the name of Steerforth, who was also kind of elegant and kind of came from a semi-aristocrat type family. Later on, he plays a role as being a villain because that girl I showed you earlier, Emily, he seduces her, he steals her away from her fiancé, whose name was Ham. And he really wants nothing to do with her except, have her as like a sexual plaything. And then, that's ruined her relationship with Ham, and it creates a big crisis in the book. So what he did was very wrong, and he knew it was wrong. He just wanted to have a little fun, so he's not a nice guy. Okay, here is David when he's young on getting a piggyback ride from the guy named Ham. And this little boat was a house, Mr. Peggotty's house. Miss Gummidge is sort of the lady servant helper there. And this is young Emily, and David will become good friends with her when they're young, just sort of a childish puppy love sort of thing. There's Miss Peggotty. She is the sister of Mr. Peggotty, who owns the houseboat there. Okay, here was the cover picture of the book, young David with the pretty Emily. And she's a very nice girl, but, she's not too educated at all. And she has this naive idea someday she wants to be a lady, like almost an aristocrat. And that's why she runs off with Steerforth to her own detriment. And she left Ham, which was sort of a hypergamy, not a nice thing to do, and she paid a very high price for it. Okay, it was much more costly to be promiscuous and bad behaved in those days than it is nowadays. Here's just another book cover for David Copperfield, and he was a bit of a street urchin for a while too. He had a pretty difficult childhood. In real life, David Charles Dickens was very poor for parts of his childhood, and his father was in prison for debtor's prison for a while. And at one point, David was so destitute, he went and visited an aunt of his, Mrs. Trotwood, who was kind of cold on the exterior, but her interior, she did have a good heart, and she took him in and she was nice to him. And that was an important moment because he was sort of a homeless, poor orphan at the time, and he'd been brutalized by his stepfather and his stepfather's sister, his step aunt. So this was a turning point for him that Mrs. Aunt Trotwood, Betsy Trotwood, took him in. And then he also ran into this guy in the book called Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber was very nice. In real life, from his autobiography, Mr. Micawber was patterned on his father. Very talkative, articulate, clever fellow, but a bit of a screw-up. Always getting himself into debt, getting himself into trouble, having bill collectors coming after him. But he was very lovable and nice. And this was a lady named Agnes Wickfield, who was the daughter of a guy who owned some type of financial business. And David stayed with them for a while, and he sort of became very close with her. He thought of her almost as like a sister. And she was in love with him, even though she didn't say it. And she was very good. She's sort of like the best person throughout the book, Agnes Wickfield. Kind of reminded me of like the first husband in that book about the Civil War, Gone with the Wind, who was, I forget her name, but she was super nice, the first husband of Ashley. Anyways, getting back to David Copperfield, the book, this guy right here is called Uriah Heep, and he's very creepy. He just gives you the creep. He always pretends to be nice, but in such a backhanded way, he just gives you the shivers. Here's Mr. Micawber. Here's Mrs. Micawber. She's very nice. And again, they're patterned after his parents. And Uriah Heep turns out to be quite the villain, and he screws over Mr. Wickfield. But in the end, Micawber figures it out because Micawber had been given a job with Wickfield, and he figures out that Uriah Heep was screwing over Mr. Wickfield and pushing him into poverty and psychological problems, gaslighting him, in part because he wanted to steal his money, but also in part because he wanted to marry the daughter, Agnes, okay? The one I just showed you a picture of a moment ago. Here's David's first love, his first wife is Dora, and she's very nice, and he loves her. But she's very frail, and she actually gets sick and dies. Here's another picture of David with Dora. And he loves her, and they were both happy, but she got sick and she died. David goes away for a while to Europe. He comes back, and then he falls in love with Agnes, and they get married, and that's how it ends, sort of happily ever after. Okay, so what do I think of this book? I think it's a very good book, or a good book. I wouldn't call it a great book. I very much more liked the Christmas Carol by David Copperfield. I think that's by far his best book. It's magnificent. I think that's actually the greatest novel of all time. It's real fast. You can read that in a day, whereas this is a much bigger book. Look at this. It's like a 1,000-page book. Okay, it's a big honking book. These are big pages. Back in those days, there wasn't any other competition. There was no TV, there was no radio, there was no movie theater, so people like to read these big triple-decker books, and this is one of them. Great character development. It was written in serial publishing through like a newspaper, so people would look forward to the next month's issue. Does really good character development. The characters are pretty round, so to speak, well developed. Let's see what else. Mr. Micawber was sort of the fun, pleasant, joyful, joking, hyper-articulate, ebullient character. A lot of the poor people were very nice. A lot of the wealthy people are jerks, and that's kind of one of the messages of the book. Don't judge people just by whether they're wealthy or poor, because that's not going to determine whether they're nice or not. Great novelists, they maintain a sense of reality, verisimilitude. Dickens is great at that. Dostoevsky, Hugo, Margaret Mitchell in Gone with the Wind, Michael Crichton and all his suspense thriller books like Jurassic Park. So I noticed that's characteristic of the great novelists. They can maintain the storyline real tight all the way through. But what I also noticed about novelists, one thing I don't like about them so much, most of them, they're not that much fun. They don't really have that many great lines. They just have a good story that they tell tight. Whereas I kind of like, like the Irish playwright, like Oscar Wilde, who's throwing off all these one-liners that are kind of funny, memorable one-liners that I can keep with me. Okay, the big events in these books, Dostoevsky, Alyosha was a good Christian, good man. That's how you should live. Victor Hugo and Les Miserables, the bishop, Venu, forgives Jean Valjean, and Jean Valjean goes on to do all these great things. Javert follows his own code of ethics, but he's kind of a jerk and a scumbag, okay? That's what I get out of Les Miserables, all right? Anyways, let's see what else. Typical things you get in the Charles Dickens novels. Good names, Blunderstone, they moved to the wrong house. Murdstone, great name for an evil villain. Although he's like the most evil person in the whole book, followed by Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep's much more creepy. Murdstone's just more brutal. Lots of conflict, setbacks, typical things in a novel to hold your interest. That you have a likable protagonist, likable hero is David Copperfield. You do like him. You feel yourself rooting for him. He's like Charles Dickens as a young man. He gradually starts becoming a writer and eventually gets some success with that. You have to have villains. That makes the story more interesting. The school teacher was sort of frightening. The way he hit the children is very brutal and evil. Also, Steerforth was another villain who looked nice at first, but then you realized, he just brutalized the vulnerable Emily, and to some extent she deserved it by abandoning Ham, the good man who loved her. She got what she deserved to some extent. That's part of the message there, I think, as well. I recognize, too, how David had such a crappy education. He got an education in real life of, the school of hard knocks, dealing with all these nasty people. But he really didn't do much book learning. Not until much, much later did he finally get some book learning when he went to a better school. But his early childhood for a long time was just a waste of time, kind of like what I think of the public schools. Looking back, I wish I had learned the Greeks and the Romans and the Bible when I was young, additional languages, how to draw. That would have been very valuable to me. Instead, it was just a big waste of time up until I was about 18 years of age, other than playing sports. And, luckily I had my father to watch BBC specials and talk about English novels, even though I didn't really understand them. It was still good for me. Good common folk, the people like Agnes and her father. She was sort of the heroine of the book. Miss Peggotty as well. Lots of bad luck, for these people. They suffered a lot, in the industrial age in England. His father dead before he's born. His mother and his new baby brother dead very young. He's an orphan at around 8 years of age. Okay. So anyways, I think it's a good book, not a great book, but, a good way to read this thing. I read it on a treadmill. I'm just sitting on a treadmill and I'm blowing through the book. Gives me something to do so I could walk 2.5 hours at a time. So do I think it's worth reading? Yeah, I'd recommend, listen to it on audiobooks and then going back to it if you want. So anyways, hope you found that helpful.